I'd like to bring into the discussions Associate Professor Brendan O'Connor. Thanks very much for joining us. You're from the US Studies Centre, and one of the people that we're talking to from that centre this evening. Thanks very much for coming onto the program and talking to us about your unique insight, because you are different to so many people, because you've actually worked in the World Trade Center, obviously prior to September 11. And so when you watched from Australia, a place that you had worked in being under attack in such a way, and the people there desperately trying to flee, it must have been a unique experience for you as well.
It was very dramatic. I worked in the World Trade Center just for a brief period of time, but I think a lot of people who have travelled through New York would have had that sense of familiarity with those two iconic buildings. And I think the way it unfolded, 9:15, one building is hit, quarter of an hour later, the second tower is hit. Half an hour after that, there's an attack on the Pentagon. Then an hour, at about 10 o'clock, one of the World Trade Center buildings falls down, and then about another half an hour, another one collapses. So that unfolding drama, people getting out, the firefighters being trapped, I think it was an incredibly sort of captivating story. And I suppose, worried about friends of mine, colleagues of mine, and was captivated. I remember being up for hours that night just watching the television. But I think a lot of people would have experienced it the same way, of that enormous surprise, the human drama of it, and this wonder of, well, what does all this mean? Who's done this, and what will be the consequences? And I suppose those things made this such a dramatic event. And I think for a televised event, it's really hard to think of anything of a parallel, particularly in the last 20 or so years.
Did your friends and colleagues get out?
Yes, they were fortunate. Some of them had moved on. One of my boss at the World Trade Center was sick that morning, was in bed. They were lucky stories. They were lower on the building, most of the people I worked with, so it was fortunate. But there was obviously, people listening to the 10th anniversary stories today on the television, on the radio, many tragic stories. And I suppose that human drama was felt much more maybe by Americans who were captivated by those human stories, maybe had a connection with someone, where I think in the rest of the world there was an enormous amount of sympathy, but over time people started to say, well, there are other tragic things in the world as well, and that emotional connection wasn't quite there in the way that it was for many Americans.
I'm still amazed at those pictures, watching those pictures, even with this 10th anniversary. In your role at the US Studies Centre at Sydney University, you do a lot of writing about the relationship between Australia and the United States. You talk a lot about anti-Americanism, but you've also remarked on something that I found interesting, that not everything changed that day. And certainly that goes against the tide of a lot of writing and certainly a lot of feelings on this 10th anniversary, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the world is a very big place. There are parts of the world where maybe even this event wasn't, seen in the same way. I mean, television is so widely spread that most people would have seen it and captured it in some way. But there were, I suppose, events unfolding in Africa and the Middle East, deep problems of people having in their own societies, which I think to some extent there is a tendency to maybe sort of overlook because the television cameras aren't in those places. They weren't in Rwanda or they weren't in the Congo, when literally hundreds of thousands of people were killed. So I suppose there is this tendency or criticism to say, why do we always look at American events in this way that we feel sort of intimately connected with them in a very detailed way, and why aren't we concerned about some of the other problems in the world? So I think that's one sort of view that I suppose you could take on.
And does that lead to what you've discussed as that anti-Americanism? Because one of the things you wrote about was at the time of September 11, Americans were shocked, surprised at why do they hate us? What have we're so good, I think was the quote from President George W. Bush.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think there was an enormous amount of sympathy really after that event. I mean, some people maybe thought the coverage of the event was a bit emotional and went on for too long, but I think that's really at the edges. I think it was the Iraq War in 2003, the move to the Iraq War through late 2002, that really turned the tide against the United States in a pretty dramatic way. And we've never seen the United States in opinion polling in Europe as unpopular as it was in 2003, 2004, 2005. These were just very, very difficult years for the sort of people-to-people relations with the United States. And to some extent, the election of Obama has changed things in Europe. It hasn't changed things as much in places like Jordan or Pakistan, where there are still very, very deep tensions between the United States as a country and public opinion in those countries.
What do you think 10 years on of the relationship between Australia and the United States? Is it just continuing to strengthen?
Well, I think the United States and Australia came together in, an incredibly close way after this event. I think the experience of Prime Minister Howard was very much central to this. Our decision to support America in the Iraq War really led to a bonding of the two countries, which is probably unparalleled. You could say there were some things like that in the Second World War out of desperation on our side to some extent. But this incredibly close relationship. But I suppose for some people there's been an unease as well of, well, what was the cost to Australia as a country? Were they the right decisions? So I think there's just a tremendous amount to reflect on 10 years on. It's been a very busy period in world politics. And I think there's some sense that maybe we're very fortunate that we haven't had another one of these attacks, but at what cost has this come at?
Associate Professor Brendan O'Connor, I'd like to talk to you more, but unfortunately we have to go. Many thanks for coming in and sharing your insights with us.
My pleasure.
Associate Professor Brendan O'Connor there talking to us from the US Studies Centre attached to Sydney University.